So I'm going to decide that we get started. Hello, my name is Christine. Bonjour, je m'appelle Christine. My pronouns are she, her, and elle, and I am the moderator for this session entitled AskAway Chat Reference During COVID-19 Research Findings. I'm moderating today from Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. However, I recognize that you may be joining from a place that is different from this, and as such, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous peoples, lands, and waters near you by consulting native-land.ca, and I'll put the link to that in the chat after this precursory moment. This session is being recorded and closed captioning is enabled. Please reduce your streaming quality and keep your camera off when not presenting or interacting with others. All in attendance are subject to the Forum Code of Conduct, and this session will be 20 minutes long, followed by a 10-minute question and answer period. At that time, participants will be welcome to ask questions. You can use the chat function for informal exchange on Zoom and the Q&A feature for questions to direct at the presenters. If you'd like to ask an anonymous question, I will put the link to our Padlet in the chat as well. And if you experience any technical difficulties during this session, I invite you to send me a direct message on Zoom, or you can email us at lib-forum@concordia.ca. And now I will turn it over to our presenters.
Right. Thank you for that introduction 10 minutes after, but I think we've all taken a deep breath and we're good to go here. So we're going to be talking about our research project, AskAway Chat Reference During COVID-19 Research Findings today. And oops, without fail, the Zoom controls move in an unexpected way. Give me just 1 second there. All right, excellent. So we're really grateful for this opportunity to meet with you today. My name is Barbara Sobol, and I work at the University of British Columbia on the Okanagan campus. I'm joined by my co-researchers, Aline Goncalves from Yukon University, Patricia Foster, also from the University of British Columbia on the Vancouver campus, and Aditi Gupta from the University of Victoria. Aline is going to add some links to the chat to acknowledge the varied Indigenous lands from which we are joining you today. We hope that you'll take a moment to explore these links as they give insight into some of the resources that our libraries provide to connect patrons with relevant local Indigenous resources and perspectives. And as we're speaking today about a research project tied to the AskAway Chat Reference Service, we'll also acknowledge that this consortial service, hosted by the British Columbia Electronic Library Network, includes all post-secondary institutions throughout the vast geography of British Columbia, as well as Yukon University, obviously situated on many Indigenous lands spanning that huge region. Personally, I work at the Okanagan campus of UBC, which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aditi for our next section.
Thanks, Barbara. So Barbara is the main, I would say the main lead for the project, and she brought all of us together, very brave. As you can see on the screen, she consulted with the Electronic Library Network of BC and determined that the chat transcripts could be used as a data set. So AskAway is a provincial service that's offered here in British Columbia. And it's the chat service that we all take part in. She sent out an email to a number of BC library listservs in an effort to find collaborators, and most of us here responded to that email, including many others listed on the screen here. The top part of the list of institutions represents the people that basically contributed to this research. Some of them are still with us, but many others had to step back from the project due to different commitments. In total, there were 14 people from 8 institutions that formed our collaboration. And next slide, please. This is what our collaboration has looked like over time. After the initial email call for participation that was sent out by Barbara in 2021 June, we held many, I can attest to that, virtual meetings on a monthly basis with an agenda that she also kept track of and also followed up with a lot of action items. Most of us spent a lot of time exploring the research questions and possible avenues for analyzing the data. We also collectively set goals for publication and also conference presentations like this one. But on the whole, we also revised our data analysis and also asynchronously, I think, met in groups or subgroups, I must say, and also wrote up an article collectively, but with some subdivided responsibility. With that, I'm now going to pass it on to Patricia to share some more thoughts.
Patricia, we can't hear you.
Thank you, Aditi. So we'll now talk about tools for collaboration and analysis. Next slide. Thank you. Our project tools for collaboration. This project has benefited from a series of technology tools to facilitate our geographically dispersed and asynchronous population. As you can see from the list here, this list of tools supported collaborative communication and were web-based, free, and user-friendly. We also communicated by email listservs, set up meetings with Doodle, met virtually on Zoom, recorded meetings for those unable to attend, using file sharing through MS OneDrive. We also collaborated on all documentation by the Google Drive using Google Docs and Google Sheets. As AskAway virtual reference providers ourselves, distributed throughout British Columbia, who also use collaborative tools such as Library Help and Campfire chat software to interact with ourselves and library users, much of this is already commonplace behavior. We used all these tools consistently from the start and didn't experience technology as a barrier to our group work. Next slide. This list of research tools that we explored and is selected with the exception of LIWC, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count software, which is fee-based, were available to us either through our schools or they were free to use. Tools such as In Vivo were deemed too user-intensive, and while they were existing sentiment analysis modules, they were not included in our institutional subscriptions. A random sample of the LIWC dataset was run through a series of text analysis applications and tools, which allowed us to assess the general format and content of the datasets that we had as a means to identify which tools would most adequately answer our research questions. Functionality was also used to correspond with your queries of interest, and we leveraged and matched the existing researcher expertise on our team to tools that would work best for our project. As a result, R and Python Pandas were selected for metadata and quantitative chat analysis, and LIWC and Voyant were selected as tools for textual dataset exploration. Voyant is a textual analysis tool used in the digital humanities using visualizations and is useful for discovering patterns and relationships in textual corpora datasets. The LIWC analysis tool, in this case, uses sentiment analysis to make a determination on people's social, psychological state in their textual language. And here, word count distributions are used to create psychologically meaningful measurement dimensions. And finally, I'll also mention our citation management software tool that we selected, which was Zotero. So to conduct our literature search, our team devised a search string to search for relevant articles on virtual chat services and probe databases such as Academic Search, LISA, and ERIC, to name just a few, to gather our citations. We collaboratively used Zotero to gather and review these citations and use inclusion-exclusion criteria and use the selected literature to support our subsequent discussion. Next slide. And I believe it's Aline will take us through methods and findings.
Thanks. So can I see the next slide, please? So we'll talk about methods and findings. So first, for data acquisition, we obtained data directly from Library Help. That's the vendor that provides AskAway with its chat service platform. So Library Help removed any personally identifiable information such as names, emails, phone numbers, URLs before the data set was provided to researchers. All the removed information included chats from a university that withdrew from AskAway during the analyzed period, chats marked as private, practice chats, and chats shorter than 5 seconds. The result, as you can see on this slide, was a very large data set of over 70,000 chats. And basically what was the component of this data set was the header, system text composed by chat date, institutional queue, and timestamps, provider and patron text. This data set was the core of our transcript and sentiment analysis. A separate data set was created for metadata information, and this included system text, and chat tags assigned by AskAway providers to each chat. This dataset was used to analyze variations in the types of chats and their distribution depending on institution size per number of FTE. So basically, we classified small institutions up to 5,000 FTE, medium up to 10,000, and large over 10,000 FTE. We identified a small discrepancy between the number of chats in the patron provider chats and the metadata datasets, but this was not considered meaningful for the type of analysis in this study. Next slide. So talking about tools for data analysis a little bit more specifically. So our programming language was used for data cleaning and to organize the data sets into subsets. So we had patron provider, and provider chats organized in specific subsets. All data sets were also divided into 3 timelines. Campus closure mandates in BC, Yukon, around March 2020, were used to establish pre-pandemic and early pandemic timelines. And the gradual return to in-person services in 2021 were used to establish the late pandemic timeline. We used Python programming language, specifically the Pandas library of Python. That's a library specific for data analysis. This was used to analyze the metadata data set, focusing on how provider tags were used pre and during the pandemic. Finally, Voyant and Linguistic inquiry and word count, or LIWC, were used for textual and sentiment analysis of the chat data set. Next slide. So our findings in terms of chat volume. So the first thing that we observed is that the types of questions coming to AskAway during the pandemic did not actually change substantially when compared to a pre-pandemic timeline, although the volume of chats was considerably higher. So you can notice on this slide that the volume was substantial in March, around March 2020. So that's essentially when the pandemic started. And then in September, October 2020, when there was still uncertainty about the availability of in-person services. This coincides, particularly in September and October, coincides with an increase in the number of circulation, ready reference, and referrals during the pandemic. So you can notice that those numbers are significantly higher as opposed to a pre-pandemic timeline. However, the distribution of types of questions coming to AskAway remained fairly consistent, with research and citation questions accounting for the highest numbers of chats in all periods. Though it's not reflected in those 2 charts that you see here, it's worth mentioning that when the data was broken down by institution size, medium-sized institutions accounted for a substantial portion of the increase, and this actually came as a bit of a surprise for us. Next slide. So in terms of transcript analysis using Voyant, so you can see kind of the same pattern that we observed in the previous slide. So things remained fairly consistent. So Voyant revealed this consistency in terms of the length of the sentences, vocabulary density, readability. They're all very similar numbers. And really the only differences that we were able to identify here were coming down to volume of words. The most frequent words used for the three timelines of our analysis remained the same, however, as you can observe on those three word clouds. So words like thank you, library, book, research, those essential words were the most frequent, and they remained consistent in all periods. Next slide. In terms of sentiment analysis, similar patterns. So LIWC revealed very little change in sentiment during the phases of the pandemic. So all numbers are fairly consistent with very little change there. The software essentially made comparisons between the words in the chat dataset and its internal dictionary according to four main linguistic dimensions, as you can see. So analytic, cloud, authenticity, and tone. So the numbers in these categories did not have great variation for both patron and provider chats. However, there are some interesting patterns that we can observe when we compare those two groups. So especially in the dimensions of cloud, analytic, and authenticity. It's possible that the use of pre-scripted language on the part of AskAway providers. So by this, we mean canned messages. They're used in the beginning and at the end of a chat, as well as for other predetermined situations during the chat. This may explain some of those differences between groups. So for example, when we talk about authenticity in provider chats and we see those low numbers compared to patron chats, this is a possible explanation for those differences. Overall, however, those numbers did not vary greatly across those timelines. And now I'll pass on to Barb for implications of findings.
Thank you, Aline. So what you're seeing on the screen here are some of the initial questions that I sent out in the process that Aditi described at the beginning, which is how this project got initiated. They read, generally, what insights can we gain by comparing the number and type of questions asked this year in comparison to last? What can we learn from the words used by patrons in their questions? Can we examine the COVID tagged questions, that's an AskAway function, for analysis of the scope of issues covered? And can we analyze the data to gain insight into the role of libraries during a pandemic? And it's really the last one that captured people's imagination and attention. And the other three that are there were slightly revised as we went on. And sorry, there's like a super loud noise in the background. I don't know if you can hear that, but I can't actually fathom where it's coming from. Okay, I'll try not to be distracted by that. So these questions originated from my experience of having virtual chat become the main venue by which I was interacting with patrons on the one hand, and the absolute diversity of questions that I was fielding on the other, especially in the early days of the pandemic. I had on chat everything from a researcher at the BC Centre for Disease Control searching for preprint and the data underlying the preprints to standard questions from students that were trying to figure out what to do with the books they still had in their possession and being very concerned about the potential financial implications of holding on to those materials. And I wondered what my experiences as a service provider meant for patrons. In a fundamental way, I wanted to know if their needs of an academic library had changed during the pandemic, and if so, how? Oops. So I'd like to I'd like to continue by highlighting that for those on our research team, virtual reference was generally viewed as a supplementary service pre-pandemic, and we know from the literature that this is not unique to the people that were involved in this project. However, when we started to examine the questions in the transcripts from across this incredibly diverse set of institutions and throughout a vast geography, we found far more homogeneity than we expected, as Aline has shown with our data. The vast majority of question types pertain to the core mission of an academic library. We expected that questions were going to vary from the pre-COVID period, and that was certainly the underlying hypothesis of the research that we had undertaken. The library that I work at was closed for 18 consecutive months for in-person services, and that virtual-only version of librarying, if that can be a word, felt incredibly different than pre-pandemic. But our research shows that despite our perception of the disruption, and it was disruptive, we're not denying that in any way, that chat was actually flexible enough to respond to those patron service needs, because the user expectations of what we were going to offer as an academic library didn't actually differ that much. They continued to ask the same kinds of questions. And we think this has significant implications for how libraries plan for disruptions, such as, renovations or, intentional changes to service. And while this can be useful when planning for another, major catastrophe, if we can put COVID in that category, which I think we can, we'll also hope that nothing like that is on our horizon in the near future. But our users don't think about libraries nearly a fraction as much as we do. And we know this intuitively, but in my experience, we tend to lose sight of it when a large change is underway in our libraries. So our research didn't examine the quality of the responses in any way that was explicitly out of scope. And yet I think our findings still have importance for staff training, in that our study demonstrates that there's an expected range of questions, which we can know in advance, even when disruption is underway, and we can prepare our staff to respond to those regular questions, even if the answers to them, have changed. Our research will be published in the June issue of Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice. And in that paper, we make the case that AskAway member libraries were well positioned to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic due to our shared virtual chat service. On my campus, numerous colleagues from other departments, so like academic advising, health and wellness, different places, they reached out to me in the early days of the pandemic to be like, where'd those chat boxes come from? Because students are saying the only place they can find like real interactive service is on the library website. And while my answer that, we had a longstanding consortial service within libraries was, utterly not helpful to them in the short term, I bring this up because not to be sort of self-congratulatory to libraries, but to demonstrate that we really do have a robust set of services, both physical and digital, that we offer to users. And as libraries increasingly branch off into sort of niche areas of service, I think we need to be very mindful of continuing to put resources to this core suite of flexible services that allow us to respond to these expected patron needs. I think we're getting close on time, so I maybe won't read all of these out loud, but there are a few questions on the screen that we did not examine, but we certainly considered, and we considered how we would try to examine these. I think that the opening presentation this morning as part of the conference actually tackled some of these as well. Aditi's part of that research team also, but analyzing 70,000 chat transcripts has some serious limitations to it, especially when you want to examine it for nuance. And yet that nuanced understanding of what our patrons' experience was is certainly something we were trying to get at nonetheless. So we leave these with you as questions that you're welcome to take and do whatever you want with, but also hopeful that perhaps they'll help to spur some questions that you might have during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing and for doing this research together. It's really interesting to see something with such a large scope and to hear what you found out of this. I don't presently see any questions on the Padlet or in the Q&A, but there's a question in the chat. So for the word analysis, did you consider excluding words like yes, okay, etc., that are going to be very common in a chat context and don't have much inherent meaning?
Yes. In fact, we went down, so there's numerous options here. In tools like Voyant, there's a sort of default expectation of stripping away those sort of like filler words, if you will, the, yes, all of those kind of words. Many of these tools do that automatically, although you can customize it. But we actually did a side project that is not part of the paper not part of our presentation here or the paper that we'll be finding, because it proved to be truly, utterly futile. But Aditi and I and our other colleague Sajni spent many hours on it nonetheless. And that is, we looked at the most common 1,000 words in each of the time periods, not counting words like yes and the. We had used a script to remove those. And we marked those words for whether or not we felt they had some sort of academic kind of, relevance or criteria. We had an agreed upon definition that we were working with. So, a word like Canada would be included because presumably people are typing that because it has something to do with research they're looking for. A word like article would be included. And we went through endlessly, and then we verified each other's, review of these words, and found that despite doing all of that, they were the same words across the board. And there was nothing, because what we wanted to do was say, could we grab, if we looked at the chat transcripts that included these words that were most academic in nature, and we then looked at those, would those ones show different kinds of questions than the data set as a whole? Would it be a way for us to examine a subset? And the answer is no, because in fact, it included so many of our overall transcripts by the time we did that, that it was not a viable method. Anyways, that's a long answer to your question, Kara, but hopefully it answers it.
It looks like it does. So thank you for sharing that. I have a follow-up question to that. You said that will not be part of your forthcoming article. Will you be writing another article about that, or did you just find that it would be redundant? I suppose, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we put it in the redundant category. And also, I imagine like many of the people attending this conference, this was a project that, for the projects that people are otherwise engaged in, this was something that many of us took on out of interest at this really odd moment. But, running a team of 14 people distributed across our entire province and the Yukon was, challenging at times in terms of the actual project management. And so we set some discrete goals, and that was like a couple of conference presentations and a paper publication, but not an endless and forever set of research outputs. So there will be a paper published out of this research. That's the goal.
That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. I think we have a couple minutes left in case anyone wants to ask any final questions, either in the chat or the Q&A or the Padlet. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Oh, wait, there is one. So it is on the Padlet. Would you be all... So it says, great project. Would you be all right to share this methodology with the redundant information with us at some time in case anyone wants to follow along and do something similar?
Yeah,
I don't know if you have that interest.
Actually, no, it totally, we actually, that's part of our plan, because you just never know what will be useful to someone else. And so in terms of the analysis that we did, all of the methodology will be deposited, or has been deposited in the Open Science Framework and will be linked to from our article. And it includes the scripting and sort of methodology that we applied to what we call the inclusion words project, sort of side project, that is included in our OSF location as well. So look for the upcoming article in June in EBLIP, and it'll link you to that information. I can add it to somewhere, the conference site as well, because that's currently available. So I can put the OSF link there also. Thinking out loud here, but happy to do that.
Yes, if you feel comfortable sending that, you could send that to lib-forum at Concordia, and we will add it to the presentation so that people who watch this recording can see it there as well.
Sounds good.
So thank you all again. I don't see any additional questions, but I really appreciate that you shared this with us today. And now I'm going to close this session and invite you all to attend our closing remarks. Thank you again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.